might reach the peak of their economy beginning to decline, and therefore they need to try and seek a solution now, or in his words, the two things which would lead to a ceasefire are the need to regenerate in time before they came again, or regenerate their economy, because you just can't keep going indefinitely unless you're supported in ends, ways and means terms by other countries. And again, that is the other variable about what support they might get from Iran, China, North Korea. And that's also, of course, where the notion of future sanctions, certainly from the Senate or the legislature in America, comes in, not yet from the executive.
Also, Russian dictator Vladimir Putin has ordered his army to create so-called security buffer zone along the border with Ukraine. Also, Russian army has begun its offensive deep inside the Sumy region. Russian sites 4 border villages in Ukrainian Sumy region. However, this advance has been halted by the resistance of the Ukrainian armed forces. What is your assessment of this Russia's war efforts in the Sumy region to create so-called buffer zone?
Well, I think the buffer zone from a Russian perspective is a movable feast. It's a creeping buffer zone. In terms of the grand strategic objective, I think that they see all of Ukraine as the buffer zone. That's certainly the sort of language which Medvedev is using at the moment. So they will always move that again. At the moment, they're seeing it as a buffer zone for the strikes that Ukraine are doing over the border. So from a tactical perspective, that would make sense from a Russian viewpoint, but let's not kid ourselves. What they mean by a buffer zone, they mean extending Russian sphere of influence all the way to the former those countries which are now part of NATO.
Also, according to Sky News, 50,000 Russian force is stationed just across the border from the city of Kharkiv. What are the chances for another full-scale attack on Ukraine, and do you feel that Russia has enough resources to conduct large-scale operations, full-scale operations, such types of operations which were conducted after the beginning of full-scale invasion of Ukraine?
Well, as I said just now, but in another context, there's always this mismatch between ends, ways and means. If 50,000 people were an exploitation echelon with thousands of tanks and AFVs on day one of this war, you could say that might happen. But obviously, the changing character of war and the fact that the resource of maneuver has degraded of the Russians means that their ability to capture ground in a meaningful way, rather than a slugging and slow bite and hold way, means that their ability to capture ground and exploit is very caveated and very slow. As I've said a number of times, it's the chicken pecks grain by grain. And with the losses each day, 50,000 people is not something that will sustain you unless it's continuously replenished. So at some stage, they will meet the point of culmination. That is, in military terms, the culminating point is when you can go so far can go no further. And I don't think they'll be able to go much further in any of the current operations in a meaningful way. That doesn't mean they won't capture little bits of ground, but they're generally meaningless bits of ground. The odd village here and there is a tactical success, a minor tactical success. It doesn't have operational significance.
Also, according to the Washington Post, Russia's battlefield strength has started to wane, and it could run into serious shortages of manpower and weaponry until the end of this year, according to senior US and European officials and military experts. For how long Putin can continue his war against Ukraine and his war effort?
Well, I think in terms of the manpower, that is one of the choices he potentially has to make this summer. So we know that there is a sort of large amount of money being placed on getting contract soldiers. That won't sustain the manpower required at the front and to exploit further than they are currently going in a meaningful sense. In order to do that, they would have to mobilize the manpower. But then there's a mismatch between the personnel side of capability and the equipment side of capability, which is why we're seeing more and more sort of Mad Max type assaults with trying to get across the killing zone on motorbikes and all-terrain type vehicles to try and use speed as an enabler to get into the frontline positions of the Ukrainians. That again is not a way either to meaningfully do something at the operational level, nor to supply an army in a meaningful sense at the operational level.
Let's cover also recent Trump's statements toward Vladimir Putin. Trump said Sunday that Russian President Vladimir Putin has gone absolutely crazy. Do you feel that Trump is getting really frustrated about Putin's actions, and could this lead to serious decisions, sanctions against Russia, or even increased support for Ukraine?
Well, the one thing that you can say, and the word that you can always apply, I think, to President Trump is mercurial, which in English is that someone who's subject to sudden or unpredictable changes of mood or mind. Now, we've often thought for the last 3 or 4 months that the pressure strategy should be put on Russia, when often Trump has been putting a pressure strategy more on Ukraine. That is, he's rewarding the aggressor and almost at times been setting the conditions where he expects Ukraine to give such significant concessions that it would lead to a surrender peace and not a just peace. I think that Trump caveated what he said about Putin by really diluting a bit at the end by also saying that President Zelensky was also an obstacle and a bit of a pain. So he rather diluted his message by doing that. What I do expect we'll probably see is that the Senator Graham Blumenthal axis will sponsor in the Senate a bill for this maybe 500 the tariff of 500% on those nations which are supporting Russia. The Senate, of course, is more of an independent entity than the House of Representatives, where Trump still has more sway amongst those. So I see really a kind of battle between the power of the legislature and the power of the executive in America. And this, I think, is one of those curious things where Trump quite likes Putin, because he sees him able to take action without the need to pander to anyone, in the way that in a democracy, of course, you have to take other forces into play. So what I would really hope is that a number of things happen. Firstly, there are increased sanctions, including the secondary sanctions, in the way that the 17th set of sanctions has been sort of passed by the EU. Secondly, I'd like to see the more military support or continued military support, including long-range weapons from the Americans. And thirdly, I'd still like to see an undercutting of the Russian oil capability, not only via that sanctions and secondary sanctions package, but also by some sort of notion of absolutely degrading in economic terms the shadow fleet, which is transporting the oil around the globe.
You just mentioned about long-range strikes inside Russia. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz says that Western leaders, Western countries have lifted its restrictions on use of Western-made long-range weapons by Ukraine. Can you imagine a scenario in which the US will provide Ukraine with additionally long-range weapons and would allow to actually strike inside Russia?
I can, but I would again at the moment say that is just a scenario rather than a certainty. Like all these things on long-range strike, you really have to understand a bit about how targeting works. And the targeting, when you've got very expensive smart weapons which use GPS guidance for their final terminal things, comes from satellites, space power, and most of that space power is American space power,